Or we can also have the opposite, right? That the networks, the observed networks, are on the other side, that is minimizing this visibility condition because of this turnover of species, this environmental fluctuations that is happening, that is not allowing the system to basically evolve and arrive to this optimal stage. And what we found is actually that is neither of these two scenarios. What is showing you here is that the observed networks are in fact trying to reduce as much as possible the distance between the two networks. So the conditions are trying to be maximized in a way that they are matching or trying to be the same across the two systems. And I mean, if you think also intuitively, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, you cannot change, if you're a wolf, you cannot change your mortality rate from one system to another by 2 or 3 orders of magnitude. I mean, of course, there are changes because of the temperature, but things might have to be more or less the same. And this is not also typically for this system, but you can find it in forest after getting caught fire. For instance, you have all these secondary successional processes in which then, again, there's another fire and the system has to go back to the original part. And then there is never a mature process in the system. They're going always back and forth. So the systems are in the middle of this intermediate stage of development. And you can also find it, let's say, in intertidal marine zones, where at some seasons you have high tides, other seasons you have low tides, and then the community has to deal with this seasonality of the environment. And this is called pulse stability. Basically, that's the name in which the ecologists have coined it, and others also call it homeostasis. Basically, that if you the system is just looking at some properties in order to minimize or to maintain, better say, to maintain important ecological properties despite the fact of a significant species turnover. So before so if I calculate this distance, now is this distance here, but if I do any combination of these random configurations, then I'm always going to be having larger distance than the one that I observe. And this is basically called also homeostasis. But one of the requirements for having homeostasis and for testing whether it's actually homeostasis happening in the system is that I have to see that my species are coupled to the environment. Meaning that these things that they are doing is less costly than any other combination that they can do. So, how can we do that? Well, one thing is to look at the configurations. So now, this is basically the distribution of distances that I can have given that number of permanent interactions that I was showing you, 75% of permanent interactions and 25% of seasonal interactions. If I change it in any possible way, this is the distribution that I'm going to get. But I might be able to change that number, that fraction of permanent interactions, make it lower or higher. And that is going to change this distribution. I'm trying to make either easier or more difficult the fact that I can accomplish or I can get this homeostasis in the system. So I can go back to my network, and now instead of having 75% of these, I'm going to get 25% or I'm going to get 90% as long as my system or my number of interactions allow me to do that. And basically this is what I'm showing you here. On the x-axis is the number of permanent interactions. So I can go, the minimum I can do in my system given the observed number of interactions is 180, and the maximum is 360. And here what I'm just calculating is the variance of these distributions. So the larger the variance, the easier for that configuration to reach this homeostatic state. And now, one interesting thing that you can see from this figure is that, okay, there seems to be a plateau at the beginning, right? That even if you change from 180 to, say, 300, the variance is pretty much the same. They don't change in orders of magnitude too much. But then there is a sudden drop, that after a given number of permanent interactions, then the variance becomes very small, and that's basically because we are frozen the system, so we are not allowing it to move. So we are almost the summer and the winter networks are the same. So, and then the variance is very small, and we can never reach this homeostatic state. So it needs some freedom, but actually they don't need too much. So the question is, where is the system here? And if we look at, actually you find that the system is maximizing this Pareto front. basically is trying to get as much as possible this variability, so it's trying to be flexible enough, but at the same time, it's trying to increase the mutual information between systems. So it's not changing, the permanent interactions are not changing that much. It's just changing as the least effort that you can do. Of course, I mean, this is highly energetic for a species, and they don't need to do more. That's all they need to do. So here it's just showing that indeed this reorganization process, you can minimize the impact of species turnover by acting as a homeostatic mechanism and increasing the amount of information between the two systems. So just for the last two slides, actually I was going to say that, but basically this has been on the news lately because also they've been trying to do a lot of deforestation in Białowież, and they've been asking us a lot about, you know, what would be the effects. Of course, we don't know what are going to be the effects in reality, because any environmental could push you into different directions. But for sure, it's going to start changing this optimization. And in the future, they might arrive, obviously, to some other optimization process, but it's interesting, and at least it would be interesting to use these sort of techniques to monitor, right, how systems are doing. And just to mention also, it's not only theoretical stuff that we are doing at the group, but also we are doing some experimental work where now we have our system, say, of 6 species or whatever you want to put there, and then we can choose those species that we know that, okay, these pollinators can go to any of the flowers. But now what we're going to be doing is to start changing the network artificially. So for instance, the bumblebee is so big that they cannot go into any flowers. So we can put a mesh on top of the flowers so that at least you restrict that interaction here. And then from those environmental perturbations, we are trying to see how the network reorganizes. We are measuring seed production, we are measuring egg production, we are measuring honey production. So, I mean, again, if the experiment is chaos, at least you get some sweet benefits out of it. So, so this is pretty much what we are trying to do, trying to understand reorganization in these networks, and going from, because we need to understand that these ecological systems and complex systems in general are not static. They are changing, but we still have no clue what are the consequences of these things. So I hope at least I gave you some ideas for things, and if not, well, I mean, I'm happy to discuss it. So thank you.
Any questions?
Have you thought of trying some sort of like I don't know how to say it, a game theory evolutionary strategy or something like that for that maximization? I mean, I don't know if that would be interesting, but say try a multi-agent system and then like agents having different interactions to see if that's, let's say, I see it's the state. Let's see if it's also reachable as a state. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is I'm not doing it particularly, but well, one of my collaborators, because they're interested precisely in evolutionary dynamics, so they are indeed applying some of the game theoretical approaches to see whether, especially the interest here is to try to see under which conditions you would move towards this sort of larger feasible domains, because it's not clear that every time a system has to go to maximize its feasibility domain.
Yeah.
You can be in a scenario in an environment that you know the environment is not pushing you towards changing, and especially with the species, if nothing is pushing them, they will not do it. And so, what are then the conditions that would allow you to change? And sometimes even one of the things that we are trying to do with reorganization, but it's not entirely about game theoretical approaches, but with reorganizations, is like sometimes you can be blocked into particular configurations of architectures, and those architectures are going to give you a specific, value of feasibility domains under which, like fitness landscapes, right? So particular configuration that you're going to be moving around, but unless you move to a really different configuration, you're going to get into the global optimum. I'm not doing game theoretical approaches, but we are trying to understand it from the perspective of the organization, trying to understand how the geometry of this feasibility domain changes as a function of this. So that, it's fascinating.
I think your second part is related to another news. It's about the fish moving from north to north pole. Do you know that?
No.
It's about, it's like, because the network structure in the north is different from the structure in the north pole. And ecologists find that the fish moving from one to the other. And then people, when they predict, maybe there exists some fish extinct. Yeah, I think these two can be there.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is like the question that has been around for years and years. Like, what are the consequences of like introducing like an invasive species?
Yes.
Because we still have no clue about, and sometimes we just simply do simulations and pretend that some new node goes extinct by deleting or adding a link, but we have no clue. As I was just showing you, I mean the system. Typically, what we do when we look for robustness on this thing is like, okay, we delete a node, a link, and then we see how the robustness is until you just get one or two nodes in the system. But you just remove one link in these systems, and the whole thing is reorganized. So if an invasive species comes, then the problem is understanding what would be then the consequences to the network. In what particular ways is the system reorganizing so that it's changing the feasibility domain, and some of the species that are not inside that feasibility domain will go extinct. But to know that is still challenging. But I have hopes. I mean, for instance, we are working right now on a successional process in which we have, for a time series, the changes of a network in a dry forest in Mexico. So these are insects and plants. And we follow them for years. And we know how the network is changing, and we know also the time at which a particular species are coming into the system. And we see how they reorganize. That's why I'm saying with confidence that I know that these things reorganize and fast. And we have some now preliminary results showing that indeed some of the reorganization works mostly as an inhibitor mechanism for incoming species. But then it depends also on the type, on the stage of the successional stage of the successional stage of the ecosystem. So if it's on the early stages, so after a fire caught fire, after a forest caught fire, then that would be the early successional stage. Then the reorganization is happening in one particular way, which is very different to the reorganization that would happen if you let that forest go for more than 20 years. So you also have to know, you need to know the stage of your system. So there are many, many, many conditions that are just happening here. They need to be integrated in order to get a more accurate answer to those things.
Another question.
Yeah.
In ecological, there are a lot of models. When we study, how can we choose a model? Maybe, for example, here you choose this model, it works, or you have one result, when you choose another model, maybe it's different.
Excellent question. Yeah, no. Yeah. I mean, I would say, like, first of all, that at least matches with some of the main biological principles. For example, right now I'm reviewing a paper where they are assuming that predators can survive without their prey.
Yeah.
So, and this is second round. So it was not killing the first one, which I don't understand why. So at least I would say, at least try to make your models match some of the biological principles that you observe there. Then the details, I think, these are difficult to say, and it all depends on the flavors and the feeling of the. You can talk to field ecologists, also that helps a lot. You talk to field ecologists, they know tons of like what would be the best way to model them, whether a saturation makes sense for that particular organism that you're using. Ultimately, I think what you have to do is to validate. As Richard Feynman was saying, I mean, if we don't validate our models, it's not that the data is wrong. I mean, your theory is wrong, your model is wrong.
Yeah.
And So data is telling us a little bit the direction in which we can go, and we can validate our hypothesis with what is out there. So for instance, it's nice to validate. We're doing this experiment actually right now to try to validate our theory and to say whether actually having a particular nested structure is going to maximize their tolerance to environmental perturbations. We're introducing environmental perturbations in the system. And so that's, I think, doing experiments is the only way of knowing which model, and depends also on the level of complexity that you're interested.
Yes.
But yeah, it's an open, I would say it's an open door.
Where are you actually conducting these experiments?
This is in Spain. The thing is, I applied for a grant when I was in Spain, so that was like 3 years ago. I just got the money. Sometimes, you know, Spain is special. So I cannot move the money here, so yeah. So those are staying there. And especially also because the guys there, I mean, these are field ecologists and they know pretty much what they're doing. Also Spain, well, this is southern Spain, so weather-wise it's more stable than here.
It's also in Doñana?
Doñana. Yeah. So we can work, I mean, these are greenhouses, but the weather allows us to, you know, at least have a proper spring time.
Yeah.
So it's not only like 1 week and hurry up. But here you can have like 3 months of nice weather for pollinators and plants. But it's still criticized because, you know, you go with field ecologists and what they do is they don't do greenhouse experiments. They just try to do it in Doñana, like in national parks, set up some cages, experiments, and see what happens because of the environmental, natural conditions. Which is, I mean, of course, that's a nice way to do it. But then you miss some of the control of the analysis, of course. Then there are so many different factors that could change your results that, you know, it's impossible. Here we're, you know, trying to go a little bit into a more controlled setting and then doing these things. But then a microbiologist or someone would say like, yeah, you have holes in that, you know, like, so that's not controlling for anything. So at least we're, you know, trying to go in and compromise between these two worlds. We'll see. I mean, this is a high risk, you know, project. We'll see how it goes.
So it's not very common in ecology that you actually conduct these controlled experiments. Is it mostly like observational?
Before I would say it was more observational. Now I think people are moving into this, especially with mesocosms or well, in plant ecologists typically work in greenhouses. But then you have another problem because if you're interested in plant competition, let's say, what they do, they put a bucket to plants. Well, first one plant in monoculture, they measure their intrinsic growth rate, the little r. Then they put competition, so some other plant in the bucket. And then they measure the deficit in the abundances, so then that's the minus that I was just showing you for. You can get some time series, calculate that, get those coefficients, that's fine. But then you go and you get some alphas, some competition parameters that are sometimes very large. Why? Because it's a bucket, right? And that's also the criticisms that, you know, we might have. Because then you go to nature, and of course they can move, you know, freely, and it's a different environment. And those alphas, those competition parameters, now they are quite low. And then people say, well, wait, I mean, I would never expect this to coexist, but then if I go to the field, actually I see all of them together, right? So, you know, little by little, I think we're all trying to understand this thing, and I think it's fascinating because, you know, it resonates a lot with what you guys also are doing in socioeconomic systems in general. Many of the variables, many of the characteristics changing because of the market goes down, then the agents move in a different direction, and trying to understand these sort of things.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.